Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Very excited to have this panel, some fantastic leaders from across the crypto industry with us. So we're going to jump right in. I'm going to start, rather than introducing them, I'm going to ask these ladies to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about how you got to the roles you're in today. So maybe, Katie, we'll start with you.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Caroline and folks. So I joined Crypto.com about 3 months ago. I was previously at a fintech also headquartered here in Singapore called Neum, so an infrastructure provider of financial services where I built and led public policy for them. And then previously I was at Visa for over a decade. So I went from like pretty established financial services policy issues to slightly newer edge to cutting edge with crypto.
Thanks very much. Maybe, Jaslyn, you next, if you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the crypto world.
Yeah, so I actually got into it, or rather I kept a close eye on it, more from a educational standpoint, reading a lot of white papers, Bitcoin, Ethereum on the train in 2016, 15. Didn't understand a thing, but tried to read it, at least multiple times to try to understand what's happening here, right? So kept a really close tab on it until really around 2 years ago, where we really saw the inflection point with adoption for not just crypto, but Web3 generally speaking, right? Because with Web3, you see the convergence between different technologies, blockchain, AR, VR, IoT, and even cloud, for example. And so seeing the initial phases for talent flying, the flight of talent over to Web3, and seeing the explosion for innovation happening in the space. So that's actually how I got into this space. I kept a close eye and I saw people moving and I was like, this is it, I'm going over. Yeah.
And your role now?
Sorry. Oh, yeah. And currently with Polygon, so heading the institutional capital team for Asia Pacific. So what that means is working with hedge funds, asset managers, sovereign wealth funds, family offices in the region. And what that means is helping them better wrap their heads around what's happening in Web3 with all these different technologies and use cases and new players in the space, and seeing what that means for example, their family office from a asset allocation standpoint and wealth preservation standpoint as well. Yeah.
Okay. And Payal Patel, VP of Risk and Compliance for APAC for Circle. Tell us about how you got there.
So firstly, thank you for inviting me. So I have been in compliance for about 15 years now. So the bulk of my career was in banking. I was in the UK, and prior to moving to Hong Kong, my last role was at Citibank, where I spearheaded their mobile payments initiatives in Africa. And it was my first taste of sort of the intersection between technology, financial inclusion, and also sort of the way in which compliance and all its various components can be business enabling. I moved out to Hong Kong with JP Morgan, where I did something similar in terms of launching new business in new markets. And then at Standard Chartered, I headed up the correspondent banking program covering Asia and the Middle East. So really working proactively with law enforcement, regulators, our respondents within those markets to talk about international best practices, but also work very closely with our respondents and the regulators in those markets to talk about international best practices and to enable us to continue to facilitate USD clearing. I then did a very short stint consulting, which quite frankly was not my jam, but it did give me a breadth of sort of exposure across the fintech ecosystem in Asia, and I became really interested in sort of the crypto area, specifically in this region, the challenges with regulatory licenses, but also the business case and the opportunity. And so I was at BitGo for a while until I most recently joined Circle to head up the program in APAC.
Fantastic. So we've got sort of representation from different players in the ecosystem. And that sort of leads me to WAGMI, the title of this session. We're all going to make it. It can be difficult, regardless of which particular sector you're in terms of the crypto industry, it can be difficult to hire. crypto is still a relatively new industry. I often find myself saying, on one hand, crypto is only 13 years old, and on the other hand, it is already 13 years old. So we are sort of in that sort of teenager stage of development. How do you all build teams with people who both, have enough of an understanding of this relatively new space, but also can bring their subject matter expertise from, other fields and apply it into the crypto space? Payal, do you want to start with that one?
So I think we spoke about this sort of earlier. Hiring a diverse workforce here in Singapore for us, which is our HQ for the region, is definitely a challenge. There are a couple of things. Firstly, we want to make sure that the job description that we're pulling together is resonating with the market here, that we're actually building a workforce here that is reflective of the region, right? So we really want not only to penetrate the market here in Singapore, but also across the region, right? So how are we building a workforce that understands the markets in which we're trying to expand into? And that really requires cross-functional dialogue, not only sort of with our business hiring partners, but also across the leadership team, right? Because we have very aggressive commercial strategies, which mean that we need to hire now, we need to hire quickly. But balancing that with the challenge that hiring a diverse workforce takes time. It takes a proactive mindset. That means we need to go out to the market. It means that we need to translate people's skills to be transferable to the business that we're trying to build here, which in a lot of cases isn't like for like. You made the right point that it's still a relatively new space. So really thinking about those transferable skills. But yeah, it's really a balancing act, to be honest.
Katie, as you've come into this space, are there other issues that you've sort of thought about as you've tried to, grow the team or think about how to grow the team for Crypto.com here?
Yeah, I would definitely echo what Payal said, and I appreciate your framing of the life cycle of crypto, Caroline. Also because it's apropos, it's our 6th birthday at Crypto.com, so I will not request that everyone sing happy birthday, but it just shows, the amount of scale we've been able to achieve is pretty remarkable in that time frame. We've recently reached 50 million users globally, which is a growth from 10 million just 18 months prior to that milestone. So I think we'll continue on that upward trajectory. If you look at sort of the government engagement and policy space, it's net new for us. So I was hired 3 months ago. It was first of my kind within the company, which is always good fun. And when we look at our role, I really think of us as key translators. So it's important to understand the industry, to understand the technology, to be curious enough to really seek knowledge from those who have been there from the beginning, but also to be pragmatic pulse readers of the external sentiment, to be able to appropriately myth bust, to be able to reflect questions and queries from regulators that are founded on good imperatives and good ideas, and be able to relay that back to the business. So I really think of us as requiring the skill sets of understanding the technology and evolving in our knowledge, but also to be sort of realists about the external environment as well, because we are still really nascent. There are a lot of decision makers who either don't understand or don't appreciate the prospect of our industry. Obviously we're talking about diversity of leadership as well, and frankly, there hasn't been a ton of diversity and representation in either, both to lawmakers and to the broader public. So we're constantly cognizant of that in terms of who we're hiring and what features we're hiring for as well.
Just to add to a point, because I think you made the point around kind of crypto, I think, has a branding problem. It has, and it continues to do so. So for those of us that work in this space, I think one of the challenges when we think about hiring is it does feel like a potentially high risk, high reward opportunity, right? You come into a space that goes through cycles of being, super popular and interesting, and then you have a sudden crisis, and then all of a sudden everyone thinks that we're back to the days where everyone thinks that it's a pyramid scheme and all those sorts of things. So I think there is that sort of branding piece that is definitely a challenge that we navigate when we think about hiring.
Jaslyn, I mean, you're someone who sort of recently made the transition into this space. What lessons do you think from your experience about knowing, thinking that this was a space that was accessible to you, that you think are kind of relevant as you think it's sort of about building a workforce that is diverse, that kind of reflects different experiences, because the reality is there isn't some big pool of people to pull from who have, perhaps the precise, tick the box things that you're looking for.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question, because if you really look at this space, join this space professionally, I can't speak for other companies, but at least for us, when we do hire, typically a lot of so we have around 100, I think, jobs open, but typically we don't really put a years of experience requirement, because if you really look at the space, this is born somewhat yesterday, right? So it's unfair to say that you are required to have maybe 10 years of experience working on Web3 or blockchain, perhaps maybe blockchain if it's to do with, for example, engineering, but it's really not. You really have to ask whether this is something that's a relevant requirement. So joining the space, the real motivating factor was because we saw people of all kinds building in this space, right? Regardless of your economical background. So our founders, from very humble backgrounds, one of which their parents were actually doing shoe shining. So really having to learn how to, code, for example, get access to computers. So I would say economical background, gender, what your previous experiences were didn't really matter too much. What really mattered was how fast you were able to learn. How fast were you able to grasp concepts of zero knowledge rollups, for example, payment rails, now how that would be changing with, cryptocurrencies and digital assets and all these different things, right? So it's really the commitment as opposed to, what gender the person is, which country the person lives in, so on and so forth.
So more looking around sort of mindset and the kind of the potential that they have to kind of learn the space, and necessarily, the specific things that they've done previously. Thinking about, I guess, sort of inclusion and this concept of we're all going to make it, beyond just within the ecosystem, looking more broadly, one of the things that is often touted around digital assets, Web3, the metaverse, is sort of greater inclusion. I guess, what do you see, are the opportunities for greater financial inclusion, either for unbanked communities or for people who perhaps haven't had access to, haven't felt comfortable with investing in traditional financial markets? What sort of opportunities do you think that this space offers for them, Katie?
Yeah, sure. So I'm on a little bit of a personal campaign to move away from the term inclusion, only because I think it's been, back to like my visa days, and then even my previous firm looked at cross-border remittances largely for underbanked populations. And it's a really difficult metric to measure, and World Bank has thought about this. And I think when we look at Web3 and crypto, we are providing new avenues for access, and that we can probably measure. Access to investing, there are huge disparities between different categories in terms of investing, and I think there's a really big opportunity for us to narrow the investing gap as it pertains to gender. Also just mobilization of capital and access to capital in moments of like life critical need. And so there I think we've proven in quite trying times that the power of our community recently we spoke about Crypto.com's role in mobilizing capital during the war on Ukraine, and what was really interesting from our own experience through that campaign was where our users elected to contribute and how they elected to contribute. And we offered the opportunity to donate funds through fiat crypto or through purchasing an NFT. And by a significant proportion, users elected the latter, to purchase an NFT. So it shows the power of community and of, I think, a little bit of staying power of participating in, driving either charitable donations or mobilization of capital in wartime to bridging beyond just that one moment of donating to participating in a broader movement. And so certainly, and I know our colleagues have a lot of experience in payments, so I'll let you talk about that in cross-border remittances, but there's just a number of use cases that don't rely upon a bank account, that don't rely upon sort of a brick and mortar location that we've seen emerge through payments, especially in this region, but I think we'll just broaden the access and increase more vectors of access through Web3.
Payal, obviously stablecoins, beyond their role in sort of the crypto native ecosystem, are being touted as one way to improve, cross-border payments, particularly around remittances, drive down those costs, which are one of the Sustainable Development Goals. So how do you, and I guess Circle more broadly, think about, broadening, perhaps financial access rather than necessarily, adopt Katie's language in this space and what role the ecosystem can play?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we would agree, we try and steer clear of the word inclusion. So our mission is to raise global economic prosperity through the exchange of frictionless digital payments. So this idea that, we want to enable people to own, manage, save, spend in a way that means that, during COVID, for example, we saw firsthand the struggles that individuals, businesses had in terms of just being able to maintain their cash flow, etc. So we see real opportunity here. We obviously have a strong migrant worker population here who would really benefit from being able to have access and immediate access to funds and being able to send that back to their families. During my Standard Chartered days, I remember I went out to Bangladesh and I was talking to the regulator there, specifically a typology that's reiterated are sort of hawala schemes, et cetera, within that market. But the realities there are that in a lot of cases, this is a necessity, or this avenue for moving funds is a necessity because of the FX controls that are in place. So people, for example, that need to pay for medical treatments for their family in the US, the only way for them to do this is through, using cash and having someone on the other end sort of pick up a wad of cash and then, have an agent exchange it. So, in a lot of cases, we are seeing sort of the day-to-day impact that this medium of exchange can have versus what I think typically to date people have thought of as a really quick way for people to just make money.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point, that there is this, there is a sort of more foundational issue that crypto and digital assets have the opportunity to solve, and to not lose sight of that amongst all the kind of the froth and the bubble and all the headlines that kind of can happen in this space, that there is some foundational improvements that can be made to traditional finance that are going to sort of not just serve communities, but also be the sort of lifeblood of the ecosystem as well. How are you thinking about this at Polygon?
So if you really kind of look back to how this all began, right? This really started off as a grassroots movement, right? With DeFi, with a lot of the ICOs that happened in 2017, 18, with NFTs. And so this really started off with humans, with us, right? And so these were actual people who needed access to, for example, fundraisings, right? And so I feel that with NFTs and with tokens, it really created new avenues to fundraise, right? So you do not need, for example, I'm from X universities or I'm from X, so-and-so companies to actually fundraise millions and millions of dollars to pursue your, for example, your ideas or the company that you're trying to kickstart. And so that's what we're seeing, right? Not just from a founder business perspective, but there's also creators, right? So the creator economy is something that we're also seeing really thrive in Web3. So, from fashion designers to musicians to artists, right? And so it's really about the communities who were marginalized, right? All these intermediaries that were between the creators, the intermediary, and the end user, really sucking up a huge margin of their, for example, income. And so, for example, if you're not a big, if I'm not Taylor Swift, then I would not be able to go out on my own and not be with a record label, for example. And so that's where this actually created huge movements in the music industry, in the art industry. And so, for example, if you go to Vietnam, you see a lot of people students who've created fashion lines, right? And so they're also looking into the space to see how they can also elevate their business. So it's happening around the world, not just in developed markets, also in emerging markets, in all of the different verticals as well. So yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting, we often don't think about that aspect actually when we think about sort of access and so forth, that there's also, sort of by removing those gatekeepers, they're actually allowing more of that value to flow back to the creators, which is really exciting. It's funny, we often hear so much now that, we're heading into a crypto winter, but, listening to you all talk, you're talking about hiring and how to do that and, growing teams really, really quickly. But I think, market conditions can mean that, as you're leading teams, there can be a lot of questions, there can be a lot of fear about, well, what's going to happen, where is this going, particularly if people are newer to this space and experiencing sort of this turbulence for the first time. I guess as, managers and leaders who are operating in this space, but also have experience in sort of more traditional finance worlds as well, what's, I guess, one of the things that's sort of the most important thing you try to convey to your teams as we sort of pass through this period? Payal.
So two things that are sort of interrelated. So the first is sort of just remember why you moved into this space and specifically why you chose this company. So if I think about this from my perspective, I moved into this space because I wanted to use the compliance experience that I had and apply it to a new, dynamic, uncertain regulatory environment that I felt had sort of global impact and longevity. That has not changed. That remains consistent. And why did I pick Circle? Aside from sort of the amazing team that we have, the mission really resonated with me. And so how we achieve our mission may chop and change, but the mission remains consistent. So when we interview, or at least when I in particular interview, I really try and drill into sort of what are people's motivations for joining this team. And if we have people that have really strong whys and a real strong conviction around what we're doing and the longevity of the crypto space as a whole, then actually I think this is a real time when people either build or develop the resilience to sort of weather, the sort of time that we're in at the moment.
So kind of bring people back to the sort of their personal fundamentals, their personal mission of them as individuals, as part of a broader company, to sort of ignore perhaps some of the noise that you're hearing. Katie, what about you?
Yeah, I think I gleaned a little bit of perspective graduating uni in New York City during the last financial crisis and seeing, offers evaporate from traditional finance. So crypto's not immune to cycles. Anyone who works in politics or policy also knows that you're always an election away from looking at a job board. So I think having that agility and ability to kind of build back and to maintain resilience are really critical for any industry. But this is a really live issue for us, especially as we bring in new talent. So one thing I've conveyed is that anyone can execute through ambiguity. Anyone can, prove themselves at a startup or a scale up. But it's a unique privilege to do that in a moment of slight external instability and with shifting perceptions. And that's something that we can always hold on to throughout our careers. I also really appreciate, Payal, your kind of refocusing on why you joined the company and how you think you can continue to contribute. And then just broadly, regardless of where we are, in a cycle, I think that it's such a fast-moving and demanding industry to be in. So I revert back to like my sports training, and I used to do like triathlons and stuff, and like you can do a really, really hard workout, you can do a really, really long, boring workout, but the things that really shift change is when you are at your best sustainable effort. That's when you really improve. So I always tell my team at a moment of stress when we're kind of redlining or nervous, to strike that balance where you can bring your best self to work every day. And if we're able to do that, regardless of the external environment, we're personally fulfilled and we're guaranteed to grow and to evolve as individuals.
I love that, the idea of like this is actually an opportunity, this is not something to worry about, this is actually a huge opportunity for you personally to kind of build. Jaslyn, in closing, some final thoughts?
So I remember this very clearly because I was watching Netflix at home, and an email came in, and it was from our co-founder. So we have 5 co-founders, and the co-founders emailed us to the entire company saying that, with the, so it kind of started off with the Terra Luna crash, right? And so, when that happened, they said to us, focus on building, focus on the long term. We've been here since 2017, and we're not gonna, stop existing, because if you really focus on building for the long term and you have that perspective, this, like Katie alluded to, this market, especially this market, it's extremely demanding. It moves very fast, and the volatility is very extreme in terms of how much you're in the positive and how much drawdown you can potentially experience. And so therefore, if you really kind of focus on the long term, right? Our fundamental is blockchain, right? Blockchain technology, it's not, for example, crypto. And so if you really focus on the long term, you're going to do good. And if you do the right thing, then the company is going to thrive for the long term. Yeah, don't do anything short term, essentially.
Yeah. I think some great lessons there for all of us as we go through this period in the ecosystem. Ladies, thank you so much for your leadership in this space. Very much looking forward to seeing what you go on to do at each of your companies. So thank you for joining us and sharing those lessons with us.